The knock came at 3:17 a.m. It was sharp, deliberate, just 3 beats against the thick oak door. Inside, the house was silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears, wrapping around you like a heavy fog. Claire Thompson sat upright in bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. No one should be here. Not at this hour. Her fingers trembled as she reached for her phone, but before she could dial 911, the sound came again. 3 knocks, measured and precise. Claire swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet meeting the cold wooden floor. She took a breath, slow and steady, trying to calm the growing sense of unease curling in her stomach. Then the door creaked open, and Claire Thompson was never seen alive again. Welcome to Beneath the Surface, where we uncover the stories that were meant to stay hidden. Lies, betrayals, corruption, because the truth is never what it seems until you dare to look beneath the surface. Are you ready to uncover the untold? Then stay with us, like and subscribe for more exclusive content. The town of Ashford, Maine, was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked at night. A picturesque coastal town where the biggest scandal in recent memory had been the mayor's nephew getting caught siphoning gas from the town's emergency supply. It was the sort of place where people knew each other by name, where the seasons ruled life and the fog rolled in from the Atlantic like an old friend, thick, clinging, swallowing the town whole. But the morning of October 12th changed everything. Claire Thompson's house sat on the edge of town, a sprawling colonial home passed down through generations. When she didn't show up for her shift at the local library, no one thought much of it at first. But by noon, when her phone went straight to voicemail, worry began to spread. And by sunset, a search party was formed. They found the front door ajar. Inside, the house was untouched. Nothing missing, nothing broken. Just a half-drunk cup of tea on the kitchen counter and Claire's phone resting on her bedside table. Her car was still parked in the driveway. There was no sign of a struggle. No sign of Claire. The investigation began with the usual questions. Did Claire have enemies? No. Was she in a relationship? No. Any history of mental illness? Number. But then, a break in the case. Security footage from a neighbor's home showed a dark figure approaching Claire's house that night. The footage was grainy, the figure cloaked in shadows, but there was one detail that sent a chill through the lead investigator's spine. The figure knew exactly where the cameras were. They moved just outside the frame, their presence betrayed only by the brief flicker of movement along the edges. Whoever had taken Claire Thompson had planned it well, and they had done it before. Detective Daniel Grayson had seen his share of disappearances. Some were tragic accidents, others calculated crimes. But something about Claire's case gnawed at him. The clean crime scene, the methodical abduction, it wasn't random. Grayson dug through the archives searching for anything similar, and then he found it. Margaret Lorne. Disappeared 2 years earlier. Same town, same house layout, same missing person profile. Single, independent, well-liked. The connection was undeniable. As Grayson traced Claire's steps in the days leading up to her disappearance, a chilling pattern emerged. A series of strange calls to the library where she worked. No voice, just silence. And then, a whisper. "Do you remember?" Claire had confided in a friend about the calls, said they made her feel like someone was watching, but she had brushed them off as prank calls. They weren't pranks, and Claire Thompson wasn't the first. 2 days after Claire's disappearance, a letter arrived at the Ashford Police Department. The envelope was yellowed, the ink smudged, as if the message had been waiting for the right moment to be found. Inside, a single sheet of paper, typed, not handwritten. History repeats itself. Some secrets don't stay buried. Detective Grayson studied the letter under the dim glow of his desk lamp. The choice of words was deliberate. The phrasing eerily similar to something he had read before. Flipping through Margaret Lorne's case file, he found it. Margaret had received an identical letter just a week before she vanished. This wasn't a coincidence. The past was bleeding into the present, and the person responsible was making sure everyone knew it. 2 weeks before Claire disappeared, a security guard at the Ashford Library logged an unusual report. A man had been loitering near the archives, staring at the shelves, but never checking out a book. When approached, he left without a word. The description matched a figure seen near Margaret Lorne's home before she vanished. Dark coat, hood drawn. No identifiable features. Grayson played the grainy surveillance footage on repeat. The figure didn't look at the cameras, but there was a moment, a fraction of a second, where the light from a passing car caught his face. Not enough to identify him, but enough to see a scar, a deep, jagged line running from his temple down to his jaw. Someone in Ashford knew who he was, and Detective Grayson was going to find them. In a town where everyone knew everyone, secrets had a way of unraveling. Grayson widened the investigation, questioning librarians, shopkeepers, and elderly residents who had lived in Ashford their entire lives. Then he found her, Madeline Harper, a retired schoolteacher in her 80s. She had lived on the same street as Margaret Lorne, and, more importantly, she had seen something the night Claire disappeared. "The same man," she whispered, "the one from before." Madeline described the figure in chilling detail, the scar, the heavy coat, the way he moved with an unsettling precision. And then she said something that made Grayson's blood run cold. He was here years ago, long before Margaret, long before Claire. The pattern stretched back further than anyone had realized. Decades of missing women, a cycle repeating itself. And Ashford's past was darker than anyone had dared to imagine. And so the story continues, unraveling old secrets, lost histories, and a chilling truth that threatens to consume everyone involved. The case will lead to shocking revelations, and the final resolution will leave readers haunted by what lurks beneath the surface. He was here years ago, long before Margaret, long before Claire. The town had buried the memory, but the past had a way of resurfacing. The investigation was about to take a terrifying turn. Detective Samuel Grayson sat in the archives of the Ashford Historical Society, surrounded by dust-coated records and the scent of decaying paper. If what Madeline Harper said was true, if this had happened before, then somewhere in the past lay the key to stopping it from happening again. And then he found it. A town ledger from 1979, a section labeled Missing Persons. He ran his finger down the list of names, each one a ghost swallowed by time. Elaine Carter, disappeared 1979. Case unsolved. Rebecca Thorne, disappeared 1985. Case unsolved. Margaret Lorne, disappeared 2022. Case unsolved. Claire Thompson, disappeared 2024. Case pending. The names spanned decades, but something else sent a shiver down his spine. Each disappearance happened in cycles, every 6 to 7 years. Always a woman, always living alone. And each time the case remained open, the missing never found. Then there was the last entry, the only case ever marked closed. Grace Whitmore, found dead in 1993. She was the only one who had been found. But what did that mean? Had she escaped, only to be silenced? Had she seen something she wasn't supposed to? Grayson had to find out. Grace Whitmore had a sister. That was the first discovery. The second was that she had left Ashford shortly after Grace's death, never speaking of her past again. Her name was Evelyn Whitmore, now 70 years old, living 2 towns over in a nursing facility. When Grayson arrived, Evelyn's hands trembled as she poured her tea. Her eyes, still sharp despite her age, studied him. "You're looking for him, aren't you?" she said, voice barely above a whisper. "The one who took them." Grayson nodded. "Do you know who he is?" Evelyn exhaled slowly, setting her teacup down. "Not who. What?" She leaned forward. They called him the Shadow Man when we were children. Mothers warned their daughters not to walk alone at night. He wasn't a myth. He was real. And I saw him." Grayson held his breath. "What did you see?" Evelyn's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "The night Grace disappeared, I heard a sound outside our window. I looked out and saw him, a man with a scar running down his face, dressed in black, standing perfectly still beneath the street lamp." She swallowed. "He didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stood there, watching our house." She shook her head. "Grace left that night. She said she was going to meet someone. I never saw her again." "Did you tell the police?" Grayson asked. Evelyn laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Of course, they dismissed it, said she ran away. But I knew better." She reached for a drawer, pulling out an old newspaper clipping. "This is the only piece of proof I have." Grayson took it, scanning the faded headline. "Unidentified man found dead in Ashford Woods, 1993. The body had been discovered 2 miles from town. No ID, no family, just a scar on his face. The same scar Evelyn had described. The same scar caught on the grainy security footage outside the library." Grayson's blood ran cold. If the man from Evelyn's past was dead, then who was taking the women now? As Grayson drove back to Ashford, Evelyn's words gnawed at him. If the original Shadow Man had died in 1993, the disappearances should have stopped. But they didn't. That meant one of two things. Either someone else had taken up his work, or this had never been about one person at all. It was something deeper, a ritual, a cycle. And cycles could only be broken by understanding their origins. The deeper Grayson dug, the more disturbing the truth became. Claire, Margaret, Rebecca, Elaine, each had lived in homes built on the oldest parts of Ashford. The land itself carried the weight of history, its secrets buried beneath foundations and forgotten records. And then, the final piece fell into place. Claire had received silent phone calls before she vanished. So had Margaret. So had Grace. Grayson checked the call logs again, focusing on the numbers marked "Unknown Caller." Each call had come from the same place, a decommissioned psychiatric hospital 5 miles outside Ashford. Someone was still there, and they were watching. The last phone calls Margaret and Claire received had come from an unexpected source, a decommissioned psychiatric hospital 5 miles outside Ashford. It had been shut down in 1986 after reports of abuse and malpractice. Grayson found his way inside, the halls lined with peeling wallpaper, old patient files scattered on the floor. In the records room, one name appeared more than any other: Daniel Whitmore. Admitted, 1975. Discharged, never. Grayson's pulse quickened. Whitmore. That name again. He turned the page. A faded photograph stared back at him, and beneath it, a description: scarring along left side of face due to childhood injury. Grayson's breath caught in his throat. Daniel Whitmore had been a patient at Ashford Psychiatric Hospital, but no one ever recorded his release. There was a house on the edge of Ashford that no one lived in. Overgrown weeds twisted through the fence, the windows were boarded shut, and yet, every so often, a single light flickered inside. Grayson approached carefully, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The front door creaked open under the lightest touch. Inside, dust covered everything, but the air smelled wrong, like something had been here recently. He moved deeper into the house, past the empty living room, through the silent kitchen until he found the basement door. His stomach twisted. He knew what he was going to find before he even stepped inside. Chains bolted to the wall, scratches along the concrete, a single chair, its legs worn from struggle, and in the corner a pile of old cassette tapes labeled with names: Margaret, Claire, Rebecca, Elaine, and one more: Grace Whitmore, the only victim ever found. But what had she lived through before she died? Grace Whitmore had survived, but barely. She had been found in the woods outside Ashford in 1993, barefoot, half-starved, and muttering about someone who had been watching her. But no one ever listened. The town was just relieved to have her back, until she died 6 months later, her body found floating in Blackwood River. Officially, it was ruled a suicide. Detective Grayson had his doubts. He sifted through the police reports from 1993, flipping through interviews with the Whitmore family. Grace had never spoken clearly about what had happened to her. The only thing she ever said was a single phrase, over and over. "He was here long before me." Grayson stared at the words, handwritten in an officer's notes. Who was he? Back at the abandoned house, Grayson dug through the pile of cassette tapes. Most were unmarked, their labels faded with time, but one caught his eye. The writing was smudged, barely legible. Grace, 1993. His hands trembled as he placed the tape into his recorder. The static-filled silence sent a chill down his spine before the faint sound of breathing came through. And then, her voice. "He was here years ago. Long before me. Long before Margaret. Long before Claire." A muffled sob, then a whisper so soft Grayson had to strain to hear it. "I thought he was a man, but he's not. He never was." The tape cut off. Grayson felt a bead of sweat trickle down his temple. Grace had tried to tell someone, but no. Determined, Grayson searched through Ashford's property records. The abandoned house wasn't in the official records, not listed as owned, sold, or even built. But the land it stood on had been purchased in 1901 by a man named William Ashford. He's Ashford, the town's namesake. His fingers tightened on the paper. The town's founder had lived on this very plot of land, and for over 100 years, women had vanished here. He looked at the old records again. William Ashford had a son, Daniel Ashford. But there were no death records, no burial records, nothing to indicate what had happened to him. Because Daniel Ashford had never died. Evelyn Whitmore hadn't spoken to anyone about her sister in decades. But when Grayson arrived at her door with a photograph, an old grainy black and white image of Daniel Ashford, her face turned pale. She pointed a shaking finger at the photograph. "That's him. That's the man Grace saw watching her." Grayson's heart pounded. The photograph had been taken in 1932. Long before the town bore his family's name, Daniel Ashford was already a mystery. Born in 1895, he was the son of William Ashford, the town's founder and a man of immense wealth and influence. But while William Ashford was celebrated, Daniel was a secret, a son kept hidden, his existence only whispered about in the shadows of high society. No one knew why. Some claimed he had an illness that prevented him from being seen in public. Others said he was violent, unstable, a monster in the making. And then, in 1923, he disappeared. The official story was that he died. But there was no body, no funeral, no grave. Just silence. Detective Grayson dug deeper. There were records of the Ashford estate, built at the edge of town, a mansion that no longer stood, burned to the ground in 1925. But there was one structure that remained, a guest house with no documented occupants. Grayson combed through old police reports. The fire had been ruled an accident, but a witness statement caught his eye, filed by a woman named Eleanor Carver. Eleanor had been a maid in the Ashford home. Her statement was short but chilling. "I saw him in the window the night of the fire. Mr. Daniel. He was smiling." Grayson leaned back in his chair. If Daniel Ashford had truly died before the fire, what had Eleanor seen? Or worse, who had she seen? The more Grayson searched, the more he found. Daniel Ashford's name resurfaced in a place he hadn't expected: the records of the Ashford Psychiatric Hospital. A patient admitted in 1919, transferred to a private wing, no visitors, no release date, and then nothing. His file stopped in 1923. The same year, he disappeared. Grayson's stomach turned. Had the Ashford family hidden him away? And if so, why? A final note scribbled in the margins made his blood run cold. Patient displays unusual resistance to aging. Subject appears the same over multiple assessments spanning years. He reread it. Then again. Resistance to aging. What had they locked away in that hospital? And was it still out there? Detective Grayson stood outside the ruins of the Ashford guest house, his mind racing. Resistance to aging. Was it a medical anomaly? A hoax? Or something far more sinister? He retraced Daniel Ashford's trail, following whispers in old records, forgotten testimonies, and unmarked graves. And then he found it. The last known sighting. The same year, Grace Whitmore was found in the woods, terrified and broken. A witness, an old gas station attendant, had filed a report that no one took seriously. A man came through one night, didn't look right, dressed old-fashioned, real polite, but his eyes, they were too damn young for his face. The attendant had written down a name from the man's ID. Daniel Ashford. Grayson's blood ran cold. If Daniel had been born in 1895, he would have been almost 100 years old by then. If Daniel Ashford was still alive, he had a pattern. He returned to the town every few decades, leaving behind whispers, disappearances, and unanswered questions. Grayson knew he had to set a trap. He went public with his findings, holding a press conference, calling attention to the Ashford case. He knew it would draw out the one person who had avoided the light for over a century. And it did. Days later, a man arrived in Ashford. He had no ID, no records, no history. Just a name, Daniel Ashford. He was arrested outside an abandoned house at the edge of town. The same house where Grace Whitmore had been found years ago. The man in custody was unnervingly calm. He didn't resist. He answered no questions. His fingerprints matched nothing in the system. But his DNA. His DNA was unlike anything they had seen. Nearly identical to a sample taken from the Ashford family crypt decades ago. He wasn't just related to Daniel Ashford. He was Daniel Ashford. No disease, no disorder, no logical explanation. The man sitting across from Grayson had lived over a century, unchanged. And then he spoke. I've watched this town grow old. I've seen people forget. And when they remember, I make sure they forget again. Grayson felt a chill crawl up his spine. How many had there been before Grace? Before Margaret? Before Claire? Daniel Ashford had walked among them for over 100 years, unseen, untouchable. But now, he was finally caught. And then, he was gone. One moment, Daniel Ashford sat in his holding cell. The next, the cameras flickered and the room was empty. The door had never opened. There were no footprints, no forced locks, just silence, as if he had never been there at all. The case of Daniel Ashford remains officially unsolved. The manhunt continues, but no trace of him has ever been found. The town of Ashford has buried its history once again. The abandoned house has been demolished, the psychiatric hospital records sealed. But the whispers remain. People still vanish in the woods. Strange footprints appear by the riverbank. And some claim, late at night, they see a man watching from the edge of town. A man whose face never changes. A man who was here long before them. And who will be here long after. But remember, some mysteries refuse to stay buried. And if you stare too long beneath the surface, you may not like what you find staring back. If you enjoyed this story and want more mysteries uncovered, stay connected, like, subscribe, and join us for more exclusive content.